Great. Well, I may as well start us off here, and as people trickle in, they'll hear the different parts of the little opening here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 15th Annual Women's Policy Leadership Institute. Thank you for joining us for our panel today on Black and Indigenous issues in Montana. My name is Ikutsimi Maki Beck. I go by Iku. I'm a community organizer for Montana Women Vote. I'm enrolled Blackfeet. I'm Little Shell, aka Red River Métis, and also German American. The Women's Policy Leadership Institute is a program of Montana Women Vote, and Montana Women Vote works statewide to engage low-income women and families, LGBTQ folks, Two-Spirit and non-binary folks, Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, and their allies in the democratic process as informed voters, policy advocates, and community leaders. We're really grateful today for the moderator and the panelists who are going to share with us. They're super awesome people. I personally love them, and I'm sure you will by the end of this if you don't already. And we're also super grateful that you are all able to be here with us. We hope that the information presented will inform your efforts in your community, and we look forward to staying connected with you as we work together to advance state policy that works for low-income folks in Montana. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few things so you know how to participate in today's event. So this panel is webinar style. You're muted automatically. You won't be able to unmute yourself without permission. To request to be unmuted, click the microphone icon in the bottom left corner or press *6 if you're on the phone. There most likely won't be a reason for you to need to be unmuted, but just in case. And you can also ask questions and talk with other participants using the chat or the Q&A. The Q&A is anonymous and will typically be reviewed during the Q&A portion of the agenda, which is at the end. You also have the option to turn captions on and off and adjust the size of your captions by clicking on the arrow by the CC button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Okay, good. I was just going to make sure and check that it's already been listed there so that folks who are in need of doing CC can see it in the chat. And if you have any questions or technical difficulties, you can put them in the chat or you can call our staff at 406-317-1505. You can't text that number, you can just call that number. And at the end, we're going to ask you to complete a short evaluation of the session to let us know your thoughts. And at the end of that eval, you can enter your name in a raffle for a Visa gift card or for Horsefly Dress, which is a book of poetry by Heather Cahoon, who is a local Indigenous author. So just a quick safety aside, today we're addressing an extremely important topic, but with such a topic comes backlash. And as this is a relatively open Zoom call and we have 108 people and counting, we do recommend that everyone share to the extent that they feel comfortable and that we all take into consideration our safety first. We won't be providing any of the contact information for follow-up with the panelists today for safety reasons, but please refer to their organization's contact me pages on their websites if you would like to do any follow-up. And we do ask that you provide your name and your city or ancestral lands that you're from in the chat. That was probably going to be a bunch of people, but we love to be able to see who's here and try to interact to the extent that we can virtually. And obviously, absolutely no anti-Blackness, anti-Indigeneity, or bigotry of any kind will be tolerated. That includes in the chat, the Q&A, and in your private chats. And we do have someone monitoring that, and they will kick you out if you are a bigot. So before we begin, we also want to acknowledge that what is currently called Montana has a unique history with settler colonialism. That colonization in what is currently called Montana is very recent and there are fresh wounds. Today, Montana has 12 federally recognized tribes and 8 sovereign native nations. However, forced relocation removed many folks from their ancestral lands. If you registered prior to this event, then you should have received a packet that has our land acknowledgement. We can also provide a link that has the land acknowledgement, and it provides a map of ancestral lands as well as current native nations in Montana. And arguably the first permanent white settlement in what is currently called Montana is said to have happened in 1841 at St. Mary's Mission in what is now Stevensville. And so that means that permanent white settlement happened only within the last 200 years on this land. We want to acknowledge that ever since that first contact, extreme strife has been forced upon Indigenous communities in this area. Following first contact between white folks and Indigenous folks of this area came smallpox, forts, wars and massacres, missionaries, boarding schools, homesteaders, forced relocation, forced segregation on reservations. The list goes on, and the lives of Native people have been forever altered as we continue to exist in a space with more and more settlers moving onto our homelands that were so violently taken and so recently taken. We also want to acknowledge that in Montana, there has been a history of flourishing Asian American and Black American communities whose history has been all but erased. And in addition to that fact, these people experienced extreme discrimination in Montana. All people of color in Montana, Black people, Asian people, Indigenous people have been lynched in the history of this state. So it's important that we acknowledge the fact that all people of color are struggling in this state and have struggled with discrimination, but are also extremely perseverant. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but we're survivors. We're keeping it going. We all deserve joy, and we all deserve to feel loved and to have our communities support us. This panel tonight will focus on policy change and legislation that folks are working on in what is Montana. And with the knowledge that the settler colonial project in Montana requires both a logic of Indigenous elimination and an erasure of the past flourishing communities of Black Montanans, and the pitting against of different communities of color against each other, despite the fact that we have so many intersections and so many ways in which we can be strong and work together. We have decided to have this conversation tonight, and we are hoping through this conversation we can share some of the amazing work that's happening in the area of racial justice and Indigenous justice work in Montana. So with all that said, I'm honored today to introduce our illustrious moderator, Ivan McDonald, who I'm a big fan of. Ivan McDonald is an enrolled member of the Blackfeet tribe. He received his master's in social work from the University of Montana, and since then has dedicated his career to racial and gender-based justice. His main focus has been Indigenous rights, gender-based violence, and criminal justice reform. Currently, he works as the community engagement lead for the Montana Racial Equity Project. With his sister, Ivy McDonald, he is the most recent recipient of the ACLU of Montana's Jeanette Rankin Peace Award for 2020, which acknowledged their work in raising awareness for the MMIW girls and Two-Spirit crisis. In conjunction with this justice work, he is a filmmaker, a really good filmmaker, and most recently produced Blackfeet Boxing, Not Invisible with ESPN, which shed really great light on a community project in Browning, as well as being named a Firelight Media Fellow. For the last 2 years, he has been working on his first feature-length documentary with his sister Ivy, which has received support from ITVS and the Montana Film Office. And that's actually how I met Ivan. I think his work is amazing, and I'm so excited to have him moderate tonight. Take it away, Ivan.
I've never actually heard that bio read out loud, so it's good to kind of see how it hears on the ear. Yeah, thank you very much for having me today to moderate this amazing panel with the amazing panelists. I'm calling in from Billings, the historical Upsallika land, and one of our first panelists we have is Dahlia Kilsback, pronoun she, her, hers, they, them, theirs. Dahlia is a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation and a descendant of the Assinot Band of the Wampanoag Nation. She is the current Deputy Political Director for Western Native Voice, a Montana-based organization that advocates for the democratic rights of American Indians and tribal sovereignty on state and federal policy levels. Dahlia's work has included K-12 education, tribal fishing and water rights, voting rights, criminal justice, reproductive justice, MMIW, LGBTQIA Two-Spirit plus rights, healthcare, and tribal sovereignty. Dahlia received a bachelor's in anthropology from Reed College with a focus on American Indian studies and legal anthropology. She has worked for the Montana Budget and Policy Center and as a legislative assistant to Washington State Senator John McCoy. Dahlia currently serves on the boards of the Missoula Food Bank and Community Center, Indian People's Action, and the Society of War Dancers. Judith Heilman, pronoun she, her, hers. A native of San Francisco, Judith Heilman is the founder and executive director of the Montana Racial Equity Project, a 501c3 nonprofit. MTREP is the only Black-led nonprofit in Montana. Its mission is equity and justice for historically marginalized, disenfranchised, and oppressed people in Montana with an inclusive lens, and it is fully BIPOC staffed. Judith has a background in law enforcement, affordable housing, state and national political issue campaigns, and volunteer work in homelessness and citizen foreign diplomacy. Judith's passions are racial justice and equity, access to the vote, and keeping bullets out of people. Preston Parrish, pronouns he, him, his. As the state tribal policy analysis, Preston focuses on the impacts on Indian country of state policies and budget decisions. His work aims to build power in tribal communities, increase state investments in Indian country, and uphold tribal sovereignty. Prior to joining MPPC, Preston worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors on a variety of issues, including environmental justice, college access, and LGBTQ rights. Originally from Michigan, Preston is a citizen of the Bay Mills Indian community and grew up on his tribal nation's reservation. He holds a master's degree in public policy and a bachelor's degree in environmental studies, both from the University of Michigan. So thank you all very much for being here. I think just starting right off the bat, I think maybe just starting with you, Preston, since policy is in MPBC's purview. What is some of the work that you're doing at the state level for this legislative session around policy?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, everyone. I'm happy to be here to be part of the conversation. So there are a few things that MPPC is working on, and I won't go into too much detail at this point. But sort of broadly speaking, the Montana Budget and Policy Center focuses on state budget decisions and tax and economic policy, particularly as they relate to folks living on low incomes in Montana. So as the state tribal policy analyst, I look at what those budget decisions and policies mean for tribal communities. So some of the things that I'm working on right now include some of the property tax bills that have been getting a lot of attention. So Senate Bill 138 that would repeal a temporary tribal property tax exemption that was heard in Senate Tax last week. There's a follow-up bill that we think could drop should SB 138 die. We're looking at different state investments in economic development in Indian country, language preservation, tribal college funding. These are all direct state investments that the state makes into various areas of Indian country. And then just tracking other bills and issues that have appropriations tied to them or some sort of fiscal consequence. So, that includes the MMIP bills. There are appropriations tied to some of those. So it's really broad and wide ranging, and happy to dive into the particulars of some of those a bit more, but it's sort of all over the map.
Yeah, and I think since you're actively involved in the policy sphere at this moment, Dahlia, can we kind of hear what you and Western Native Voice have been focusing on?
Yes, thank you, Ivan. So Western Native Voice, we focus on access to democracy and the dissemination of information to our tribal nations and communities across the state. Our primary interests are upholding tribal sovereignty, treaty rights, and what ensues from treaty rights, such as land, education, and healthcare. So in terms of information to our tribal communities, we do outreach with all of our community organizers on, I believe, at least 7 of the 8 tribes here in Montana. And our goal is to center our priorities off of feedback from the communities and from tribal leaders as well. And so what we have learned from our tribal communities for this legislative session, most people are interested in both healthcare access, especially considering the pandemic, as well as education and tribal sovereignty. So some of the things that we are focusing on for this legislative session, Preston already touched on, was tribal property tax exemption, but as well as voting rights and accessibility to American Indians, especially on rural reservation populations, as well as the MMIP bills, which are Senate Bill 4, House Bill 35, 36, and 98. There's also a hunting bill coming up tomorrow that would infringe on tribal sovereignty. That is House Bill 241 for anyone who is interested. And some bison bills coming up as well that are also concerning to tribes. But that's just a quick snapshot of what we are interested in this legislative session.
Finally, Judith, what is some of the stuff that the Montana Racial Equity Project has made a focus this current legislative session?
Well, we're focusing on a number of different things, but basically under the things of criminal justice, anything that has to do with criminal justice, and I put guns everywhere underneath that too. Education, anything having to do with education, and also queer trans issues for the whole LGBTQIA plus spectrum. And there are some other things that are in there that has to do with voting rights, very, very big on that. A woman's right to determine, make decisions over what she does with her own body without any legislative or legal interventions on that. That's another thing. The problem is that the problem is narrowing it down, because racism, bigotry, and prejudice, which we focus on the elimination of, is in everything. It's in everything. So it's a question of how thinly can we spread our team, and we don't want to have everybody be exhausted by the end of the session, because racism, bigotry, and prejudice carries on after the session. It's 24/365, right? So those are the things we're focusing on. There's just so many things.
Yeah, one of the things I'm kind of interested to see as I've been kind of navigating this legislative session is that there was, I'm being totally honest, there was kind of these feelings of hope just last month. And I know that I mean, they're still there, and there's these feelings of looking forward to the future. But I know that particularly in Montana, sort of our change in our state representation, and particularly state level offices, that there has been kind of this almost idea. I've seen a few people refer to it as a pushback. And you, Zalia, kind of, what do you kind of see as that almost kind of pushback in relation to maybe just in relation into what kind of policies happening at the federal level, what policies, kind of how that response is at the state?
Sorry, Ivan, you kind of cut out a little bit there. It was hard to hear. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, no, I think that in a lot of the work I've been seeing around this legislative session, people have been talking a lot about kind of a response to whether it was the election or, the new cabinet, almost a response in this state to kind of what's happening at the federal level. And what do you kind of see as the maybe possible pushback here in the state with some of the bills that are coming up this session and have already been voted on or happened?
Right, thank you. So something that comes to my mind automatically has to do with voting rights, because I know that we heard a lot of rhetoric during this election about voter fraud, et cetera, that there's really no proof of. And one of our priorities has to do with accessibility for rural populations, which are disproportionately American Indians. So we have some bills, such as, I believe I'll have to look it up, but might be Senate Bill 176, yes, that would have eliminated, or it actually did pass through the House and Senate, I believe. But so what this bill does is it would close Election Day the Friday before at 5 p.m. And what this does is it makes voting access a lot harder for people who don't live close to polling or ballot drop-off locations, who have to schedule for their families in terms of childcare, maybe for work, time off, etc. Or maybe gas is just already very expensive for some people. And for instance, people on reservations have to travel an hour or more a lot of the time in order to vote. So I believe that this kind of rhetoric that people are espousing about voter fraud and different types of fears. They are unfounded, and ultimately what it does is it limits the voices of especially American Indians, as well as low-income people and Black people, people of color, etc., due to systemic racism and also settler colonialism that Yiku had touched on a little bit earlier. And just to kind of summarize that, it's just a hoarding of resources historically. And so this is just an example of some of the grander federal level rhetoric that we have been seeing in this state.
Yeah, you know, and kind of building off of that, Preston, could you kind of talk about sort of it's almost like it's not quite an extension, but almost the kind of the flip side of kind of some more of the state, or, you know, getting into a bit more of the actual policies in relation to a lot of what you see are happening at the federal level, kind of happening in the flip side here in the state. I know a lot of people were talking kind of about that executive order from President Biden in relation to, you know, anti-trans discrimination, LGBT discrimination, and, you know, on the flip side here in the state, we have bills trying to ban, you know, trans athletes and trans youth access to healthcare.
Yeah, so I'm not following those bills in my capacity, but, you know, personally they're very disheartening, and I think are part of a broader effort that I think, you know, could very well be in response to what we're seeing at the national level. And I'm not quite sure how to say this, but it's really unfortunate timing always to push this kind of agenda, but particularly in the moment where, you know, so many people are impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, and the real kinds of policies that we should be passing should target fiscal relief and in, you know, helping us to move toward a future that begins to put the pandemic behind us. So things that are more centered around economic opportunity, fiscal relief, public health measures, a lot of the things that we're seeing right now, you know, like the anti-trans bills, are not in any way helping us to move forward as a state. So I think those are the comments that I'll offer, sort of just on a personal note in thinking about that kind of legislation.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe from hearing from you, Judith, what are some kind of that, you know, I've seen a few people, different coalitions or people involved in sort of this policy work this session, almost referring to it as kind of a post-election backlash, particularly in this state with regards to some of the, I know some of the bills we've discussed amongst the NTREP team. What are you kind of seeing in that realm?
Oh, I see this as a backlash that's been building for 16 years in Helena with our legislature and the governor's office, et cetera, the whole administration. Even though in the first few of those 16 years of having a Democrat as governor, there was a lot more chance of in the earlier years of those 16 of coalition building, and not just coalition building, but reaching across the aisle and trying to find the compromises and all that kind of stuff. And then about 2008, 2010 for sure, the backlash began. 2010, the rise of the Tea Party, loss of the midterm elections for the Democrats, who didn't expect that, but it did happen. And so there's still a lot of that going on across the nation and in states like ours. So I don't see it as a backlash to anything that has to do with the federal election or the election that was just so national and statewide in November of last year. The thing that I'm really, really happy about is the growing solidarity and recognizing the need for solidarity between Indigenous, Native people here in the state and across the nation with BIPOC, Black people in particular, because we have so many of the same experiences with settler colonialists, you know, so many of the same ones, and we've fought so many of the same battles alongside one another, and not so much, and then we sort of pulled away from that over the decades, scores of years. But now it's coming back, and I'm really, really happy about that because there's strength in numbers when we band together and we bring together these different ideas about how to approach things, divvying up, okay, we'll handle this stuff, you handle that stuff, we can work together on this stuff, but just making sure that we have wonderful solidarity. I'm thrilled by it for what I see across the country and what I'm beginning to see since last session here in Montana with the Indigenous Organizers Collective. And being able to, and MTREP being able to work with that during the last legislative session here in Montana, particularly on MMIP stuff, legislation, and Hannah's Act, and just even on trying to push through Indigenous Peoples Day, but just being behind that, but not necessarily in front of that, but just being support wherever we can for each other. It's good. I'd love to hear what Dahlia and Preston have to say about that. You've said some so far, but I revel in that. It gives me great comfort and joy. That sounds like a Christmas doodle diddle, you know, but it does.
No, definitely. One of the things, yeah, you know, kind of, I think that getting to that lived experience or sort of intersectionality of identity. I'm going to ask a question that may be a bit more in your wheelhouse, Preston. But, you know, one of the things I'm always kind of interested in, particularly with state level policy, is sort of that idea of Native American people kind of being in this different realm where not only is our lives and kind of our sovereignty of our tribes and everything kind of impacted at the federal level, we also have some of these issues around state level. And I think also one of the things that it's always important to bring up is, you know, oftentimes we have policymakers in the state who don't necessarily understand tribal jurisdiction and tribal sovereignty and the sovereignty of tribal nations. And, you know, kind of what you were talking about earlier with those tax bills, could you talk a little bit in depth about kind of how they kind of attack that idea of tribal sovereignty and the jurisdiction and kind of the meddling of state in tribal affairs?
Yeah, definitely. So for folks who are unfamiliar with what we're talking about right now, so Senate Bill 138 was heard before Senate tax last Tuesday. It would repeal a temporary tribal property tax exemption that the 2011 legislature put in place. Historical context here is super important. This bill is possible because of the federal policy of allotment. So the allotment and assimilation era, which began in 1887, this policy sought to dissolve tribal governments and reservations and assimilate American Indians into non-Indian society. Really problematic stuff. So through allotment, the federal government divided communally held reservation lands into individual parcels without tribal consent, and made parcels available to non-Indian settlers, most often without compensating tribal nations. So allotment took trust land from its property tax exempt status and opened it to property taxation as fee land. The policy contributed to the loss of tribal ownership of a significant share of reservation land. There's now a process through which tribal nations can work with the federal government to restore that stolen land, but it's lengthy and costly. So again, in recognition of that, the 2011 legislature put in place this temporary tribal property tax exemption, good for up to 5 years, that tribal nations can apply to those fee to trust transfers. Another thing about this exemption is that the 2011 legislature put it in place sort of with the understanding that one government did not want to tax another. And another important piece of information here is that property that's owned by federal, state, and local governments in Montana is tax exempt. That's not necessarily the case for tribal governments. Also acknowledging that reservation land was never meant to be part of the tax base. So this bill just has very deeply problematic roots. It completely undermines tribal sovereignty and infringes upon a tribal nation's ability to restore stolen land. And if 2019's any indication of what we can expect around this issue area, because we saw similar bills then, if Senate Bill 138 fails, we could see a follow-up bill that's also harmful and undermines tribal sovereignty that would allow local governments to recapture any lost property tax revenue should the federal government deny that fee to trust application, or should those 5 years expire. Again, it's also a bad bill, undermines tribal sovereignty, and we're sort of awaiting to see what's going to happen with Senate Bill 138, and are hopeful that it fails. And then on to the next bill, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important to note, because I noticed when I started kind of the legislative work and enmeshing myself in the policy of the state. I shouldn't say I was surprised, but I was kind of shocked that as many state legislators as there are who don't really understand the idea of tribal sovereignty and sort of all of those jurisdictional issues. So I think that's really important to note, particularly in all of Montana's policy, or all of Montana's legislative sessions, since it's such a continued threat to the state. Dahlia, could you kind of talk about some of the touching a little bit on that idea of bills that kind of affect sovereignty and tribes, and kind of as a threat to Indigenous communities? Could you kind of talk about some of the work that Western Native Voice is doing around those specific bills and the way people can support that work?
Yes, thank you. So I'll use an example of the bill coming up tomorrow, which has to do with hunting rights. So this bill is called House Bill 241, and it will have a hearing in the House Fish and Wildlife Committee. And so what this bill does is it allows non-tribal members the ability to hunt on tribal lands. And this is an issue because these rights are reserved to American Indians that are citizens of tribes due to our treaty rights. And treaty rights are the basis and the foundation of our sovereignty and our agreements between the United States federal government and our tribes. So this is a direct attack on the validity that is our tribal hunting rights, and undermining tribal sovereignty, because the state does not have the jurisdiction to be able to dictate who is able to do what, for the most part, on tribal lands. And for example, this bill comes from Representative Joe Reed, and he is a representative from Lake County, specifically the Ronan area, which resides on Salish and Kootenai and Pend Oreille lands and in the Flathead Reservation. So this is an issue because, as I said, it infringes on tribal lands. And in addition to this, CSKT has allowed non-tribal members to have to do fishing, to also hunt birds, etc. And what this does is it creates this further rift between settlers and American Indians, because the tribe has been friendly to the non-natives there, and there's a large population of non-tribal members on this reservation. So something that people can do in order to help address this issue, although testimony's deadline was today at noon, what you can do is you can submit a web message on leg.mt.gov to this committee, to the House Wildlife Committee. And again, this is House Bill 241, to let your legislators know that you support tribal treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, and you can also reach out to your own legislators, even if they are not on this committee, in case it does reach the House floor. But right now we do have our community organizers speaking with American Indian communities and tribal nations across the state, as well as we know that there will be tribal leaders and tribal lawyers planning to speak on this and to address this at tomorrow's meeting, tomorrow's committee hearing. But this is one of many attacks on tribal rights that have yet to be seen also. There's one on bison. This is another contentious issue that will be coming up, but this matters just as much or even more as Indigenous Peoples Day, because Indigenous Peoples Day is another bill that will be happening on Wednesday, and often people think that just supporting Indigenous Peoples Day and the visibility of Indigenous history, yes, it is important, but also this is ongoing history of disenfranchisement. So making sure that your voice is heard on these issues that infringe upon tribal nation sovereignty is important as well. And that's something that you can get involved with right now.
Dahlia, I really appreciate you going into that. That's so important. All of those definitely are in Indigenous issues, but I mean, that affect tribes and the sovereign nations so much. But this is something that as a Black person, I think so many Black people can really, really, really get behind and support these things that are coming up in the Montana legislature and across the nation, where they're trying to run roughshod over rights that you already have that have been established for centuries and the sovereignty. And I just want to just read a little bit from a Washington Post article here, that what you were talking about really reminded me of this. And it was Congressperson Ayanna Pressley, a Black woman, who was talking about the insurrection at the Capitol when she was there. And she recalled the, quote, harrowing and traumatic assault on the Capitol and placed it in personal and historical context, right? Personal, historical, current context. As a Black woman, she said, to be barricaded in my office on the ground in the dark, that terror is familiar in a deep and ancestral way for me. She said she was haunted by the image of Black staff in the Capitol building cleaning up the mess caused by the white supremacist insurrection. Quote, that is a metaphor for America. We have been cleaning up for white supremacist mobs for generations, and it must end, unquote. And I just see so much, not even parallel, but actually, mushing over, there, and those feelings that we have about being attacked and discriminated against and run roughshod over for centuries and upon centuries. And that's why I really love to be able to support our organization, to be able to support Indigenous and Native issues as much as possible, because we've been through so much of the same stuff. Obviously, we have diversions. I mean, we didn't have a version of boarding schools, which is so horrible, but we had our own versions of stuff regarding that. So anyway, here we are, and we want to support in any way, amplify behind the scenes, whatever we can do.
Yes, Judith, I think you make a good point. What is that amazing saying? No Indigenous sovereignty without Black liberation. Yeah. And touching a bit more on that, Judith, I'd kind of like to hear, I think in the policy sphere and kind of what MTREP has kind of been involved with this legislative session has been a great focus on the idea of criminal justice reform and reform in the state, whether it's showing support for the, I should say showing support against the recent criminal justice reform efforts to the bill we were talking about recently in the death penalty and sort of the ability to, increase the ability to carry out the death penalty in the state, and kind of the ways in which you see people being able to support policies that show up for Black liberation.
All of that, there's Black liberation is in everything. That definitely the death penalty, voting rights, trying to be restricted, reproductive rights, it's all these things. It's basically one can see it as just this army of people that are just trying to outflank the regular person, the regular BIPOC person who's just trying to live their life, trying to support themselves and their family if they have one, and extended families, get an education, all sorts of things. But things that we are continually blocked by a bunch of people who are still in charge by virtue of a majority at this point, and trying to keep us down and in our places, quote unquote. We won't have that. I am undisturbed and just continue pushing forward. And we have a great staff, including you, Ivan, in which we will continue to push forward through all of this for justice and equity. And it has nothing to do with bootstraps. It has nothing to do with bootstraps, because those boots have been denied to us systematically for centuries, all of us. And one of the things that we've been looking at is that there was a solidarity a couple of centuries ago here in Montana between Black people and Native people, and that there were Black people living on Native lands. Crow is one of them, and also there was a horrible lynching of a Black person at Crow Agency back in the 1800s, and that was done by white people who were sheriff and other people who were part of the Ku Klux Klan, and embedded themselves in law enforcement and in city governments and things like that. So there's some pretty horrible stuff. What's in the papers back then, and the papers were all written by white people from a white perspective, was extremely biased and non-factual. When you talk with elders who have been passing down this information from elder to elder there on Crow, then you get the real story of what was going on. It's pretty traumatic to actually be there where this lynching took place. There are things like that in our history all over the place. That solidarity and that kind of trauma.
Thank you for that, for making those connections. One of the things I would like to hear maybe from you, Preston, is kind of what are some really important bills that people may not be aware of that are coming up, and kind of the ways you see them being able to kind of show solidarity for these communities and voice their support for or against said bills.
Yeah, so Senate Bill 138 is definitely one of those bills. Like I said, we're awaiting executive action on that. So please let your representatives know how you feel about that bill. the MMIP bills. There are also state investments in the Indian Country Economic Development Program that helps to grow, economic opportunity in tribal communities, language preservation, tribal college funding. That's a particularly important program. The bulk of, or much of, tribal college funding comes from the federal government. It's for beneficiary students, so folks who are citizens of federally recognized tribal nations or immediate descendants of enrolled citizens. Tribal colleges don't receive any federal funding for the education they provide to non-beneficiary students, so students who don't meet that description. So they're left to absorb those costs. And tribal colleges educate tons of non-beneficiary students. So that is in Section E subcommittee right now. It's really important. And if I can, I want to continue building off the point that Judith was just making, because I think it's a really important one. When we're talking about, racism and white supremacy, that is baked into everything, which I know she had mentioned, and that includes fiscal policy, right? So state budget decisions, tax, economic policy. That is not race neutral. That's not inconsequential to tribal sovereignty. And I think it's really important that we lift that up and shine a light on that. Policies of the past contribute to contemporary outcomes where BIPOC people are systematically held back. White lawmakers from their positions of power can set policies that perpetuate white power. So even when state fiscal policy isn't explicitly race-based, those policies can deepen inequities for BIPOC communities. I mean, we just talked about the property taxes and how they inequitably treat tribal governments, wherein federal, state, local governments in Montana are property tax exempt, but tribal governments on their home stolen lands aren't necessarily given that same treatment. I also think about tribal taxation authority, which, before I say more here, the same sovereignty that allowed tribal nations to enter treaties with the United States is the same sovereignty that allows them to exercise their power to tax. But over time, state and local governments have successfully challenged, the ability of tribal nations to exercise their power to tax, again, within the exterior boundaries of their own reservations, right, which has tremendous consequences for the ability of tribal nations to provide services, programs that benefit all Montanans. In a report that the Montana Budget and Policy Center released in November, we shed a light on what this means for revenue sources for various levels of government. And I just want to quickly, go through that. So at the federal level, the government uses tax revenue to pay for about 80% of its budget. For the state of Montana, taxes represent the largest source of revenue at 44% of total revenue. For local governments, taxes represent about 36% of revenue, but for tribal governments, tax revenue is an insignificant source, to the point where the sources we used don't even disaggregate specifically for tax revenue. And keep in mind, like other governments, tribal governments need revenue to fund essential services and programs that keep communities healthy, educate children, develop workforces, so much more. But what's clear is that tribal governments are expected to do so without the usual tax revenue on which other governments rely, because state and local governments refuse to let tribal governments invest in their communities. And we know that we can't count on the federal government because it chronically fails to uphold its fiduciary responsibility to Indian country. I'm sure folks on the call are familiar with the statistic that the federal government funds the Indian Health Service as something like just 60% of need. It's clear that tribal governments need another revenue source. It's just non-tribal taxing jurisdictions prioritize extracting wealth from Indian country. So I just wanted to lift that up because I think it's really important that even for something as wonky and unsexy as fiscal policy, you know, racism, white supremacy, settler colonialism, it's baked into it all. And I think we really need to talk about it.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested, Dahlia. I've been really kind of interested in some of your takes and your perspectives around the idea of, you know, both Black and both Indigenous identity. And could you kind of talk about ways in which you see kind of those mirroring and the idea of policy being used kind of for and against those identities?
Yes, thanks, Ivan. So something that really centers like my perspective on this is the intertwined history of the indigeneity of both Native Americans and Black people. I myself am also Afro-Indigenous, but for instance, in terms of policy, blood quantum for Native Americans, so what determines someone's enrollment into a tribe and your tribal citizenship. So that legal status of your citizenship is dependent on your blood quantum, so who your parents were, et cetera, and if they were on original rolls to prove that you were this amount American Indian of this tribe in order to be enrolled, et cetera. So that was informed by the one drop rule, and they both also informed each other. Even prior to 1776, when the United States was a nation. So as colonists came to the Americas and were establishing their settler colonies, they also needed to find a way to define American Indians as being Indian enough as treaties and other agreements came about, so that they would know which descendants of these American Indians that they were entering treaties with would be entitled to certain promises, such as land, education, healthcare, etc. So that's how one of the many ways in policy in which race had a legalized sense for American Indians, and just keeping in mind that it is entwined with the history of the one drop rule, what it meant to be American Indian was defined and based on a lot of case law from what it meant to also be enslaved. And in addition, for mixed American Indians, these policies and these laws were a means to keep Afro-Indigenous peoples, so people who are mixed, both Black and Native American, from holding land as well. So it's not a new issue, it has been ongoing, but these are some of the things that we live with the legacies of when we are determining what it means to be American Indian and our indigeneity as well. So when Judith really pointed out that we need to come together and that we have experienced a lot of the similar issues, and a lot of these issues were held in policy in order to take Indigenous land and also to enslave and dehumanize Black people as well, and they informed each other. So these are some of the issues that we keep in mind when we're talking about not just tribal sovereignty, but in terms, buzzwords like decolonization and what that means. And as Ivan, as you said, that in order for there to be Black liberation, there needs to be also land back and that reciprocity, because they're built and intertwined together, although there are different experiences. So that's just some examples that really impact both communities.
Yeah, Ivan and Dahlia, did you see what George Price wrote up in here? I asked him if Dahlia, if you or I could read off what he wrote. It is so good, and he said yes, and feel free to expand upon it.
Yeah, if you would like me to, Judith, I can, or feel free.
Oh, please do, please do.
Okay, so what George Price said was what these far-right and white supremacist legislators are trying to do by proposing such anti-treaty and anti-Indigenous sovereignty laws is very similar to the early response in the South by state and local governments after 1965 to the Civil Rights and Voting Acts, passing local laws against Black voting rights, refusing to integrate some of their schools, etc. For those efforts ultimately failed for the most part because people called it out and the federal government intervened. So now it can also go here in Montana now. If we remain vigilant and proactive, keep up the good work, young activists. Federal law, the Supreme Court, etc., has consistently upheld treaty rights and tribal sovereignty against these racist attempts to terminate it.
Amen, George. Amen. And for those of you who don't know George Price, he's a brilliant elder of Native and African American ancestry. Recently retired from being a full professor over at so good to see him here and really have him weigh in on this with his wisdom and experience. Life experience is just tremendous. So I'm a little jealous of you, Dahlia, there. So what can I say? I don't know. George, I think you pretty much laid it out. I'd be interested to see if Ivan or Preston had anything else yet to say, but we do have to always be remaining vigilant and proactive. But for those of us who are Black and Indigenous, we also have to take care of ourselves as well. Because, you know, what we all know is that we live in this skin 24/7, 365. It doesn't come off. You know, when you shut the work door behind you and lock it behind you, we're back out in public. And it's so different from this business of Blue Lives Matter. And I say this as a 13-year law enforcement veteran. You know what? When I took off the blue shirt, the badge and the blue shirt, and the rest of the uniform and the gun belt and everything like that, and walked out of the building, I was still a Black person, but I didn't still look like a cop. And so the whole business of Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter, there is no comparison whatsoever. None. We're born this way. We live this way. I often introduce myself as a veteran Black person, and having far more experience as a veteran Black person than my years as a veteran cop, which were extremely impactful. And I learned tremendous lessons from that. Extremely excellent life experience, as traumatic as some of it was, as a lot of it was. So I just had to put that in there because we have a bunch of people here that needed to hear that and probably liked hearing it.
Actually, that's going to be one of my questions before we jump to the Q&A, just because I know, Judith, with your history and kind of your solidarity with Indigenous people, policy was actually one of the first, your support of specific Indigenous policy was kind of one of the first ways I learned about you. I remember your great story of going to support Indigenous Peoples Day up in Bozeman, and hopefully the one on that was trying to be passed, and kind of your support. And where do you kind of see these opportunities for solidarity between Black and Indigenous people, and, you know, in relation to policy, but also just community building?
Oh, heck, it started way before Indigenous Peoples Day. I think it was, could have been 2013, could have been 2014, winter. And I was up there during an Idle No More rally in January on the up there in front of the Capitol. Freezing. It's the only Black person there. There was brown dance and all that kind of stuff. And I was holding up my little sign, African Americans for Idle No More. That's me. And I've paid a lot of attention to who we hire and bring on to MTREP to make sure that they have the same feelings of solidarity and desire for solidarity and lifting up each other and through all of this. And yes, MTREP was one of the very supportive groups for Indigenous Peoples Day in Bozeman, continues to be supportive, but in the background of Indigenous people for statewide. There's a number of different reasons for that, but I'm fully on board with it, and hope it passes this year. We have to be here for each other because, we have to be here for each other. It would be stupid if we were, at odds with one another and trying to do basically so much of the same kinds of things, but not talking to one another, not trying to collaborate, not trying to figure out the best ways to approach things, what our particular gifts are, and who our constituencies are, and all that kind of stuff. It's just really, really important. And I'm so glad to have this conversation.
Thank you, Judith. And I think that I wanted to leave a little bit of time for the Q&A because we do have some questions in the Q&A section, and just kind of wanted to do, I think I'll just read them, and if any of you kind of feel you have the expertise to answer them, can answer those. So one of the ones is, other than contacting legislators and donating money to BIPOC-led groups, are there any other actions white Montanans can take to be more effective allies?
Excuse me, can I interrupt for a second here? Because I see that somebody has written something that I want to address, and then we can jump back to it. I think this is really, really important. Somebody has shared with the panelists and the attendees that everyone is an immigrant except Indigenous peoples. No. No, Black people were brought here forcibly. And as soon as we set foot on this territory, on what is now known as the United States of America, in August of 1619, we were immediately enslaved. We were not immigrants, and we have never considered ourselves to be immigrants. And when people, legislators, including the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, says, that we're all immigrants except for Native Americans, I was just ready to punch the television screen. When I saw that, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? We are not, Black people are not immigrants. Please, thank you. Just had to say that.
Totally.
I'm sorry, Ivan, what did you ask? Yes.
And Rachel, who's our tech person, I've asked that this person who was writing those questions not write any more questions if possible, and or get kicked out. I'm sorry, but that kind of language is not acceptable here. And there was language that followed from that person that was also, in my personal opinion, not acceptable. Okay, Ivan, continue.
So the question was, other than contacting legislators and donating money to BIPOC-led groups, are there any other actions white Montanans can take to be more effective allies?
I would just like to, I guess, address a little bit of this. So in addition to contacting your legislators, giving out money, etc., I think that people really need to consider their positions of power, especially in nonprofits, in the state legislature as well, like whether or not your voice is the one that should be dominating those conversations. So just even things like that can have a more of a ripple effect. So who do you have on your boards? Who do you have in these conversations? I know that sometimes it's not as obvious to people, but especially in a state that is, what, 92% white people. And if we're looking to have more of these types of conversations, just looking at really who is involved and who you're putting in these positions of power, because even just all of these conversations just kind of reiterate and reify these, the invisibility for one, and also just who's a decision maker as well. That's my 2 cents for something and additionally in your everyday life to consider.
I'll quickly chime in. I think I would also just offer to assume the burden yourself. Like, don't reach out to your BIPOC friend and ask them what something means, or ask them to teach you, or to assume the labor for you. Like, do the unlearning yourself, be on your own journey, and hold yourself accountable, or other white folks.
I also thought this was a really great one. How does the recent Supreme Court ruling that affirmed treaty rights are to be upheld affect the current attempts at allowing infringement on hunting grounds? So I guess some of the more recent Supreme Court cases in relation also to sort of the infringement on hunting grounds, if anyone has any question or answer for that.
I can attempt an answer at that, although I'm not a tribal lawyer. So I assume you're talking about the Herrera case and with the Crow tribe, et cetera. So a lot of the times with like state legislation that would infringe on tribal treaty rights, it may be passed, even though in other interpretations, like in the Supreme Court, it's illegal. And a lot of the times that those have to go through lengthy processes of litigation. So for instance, if this bill were to be passed, some of the tribes in Montana, if not all, may choose to enter in a lengthy litigation process in order to counter this law that would be against our treaty rights. So even though it is against treaty rights, for instance, even the United States federal government has infringed on treaty rights, right? In terms of water rights in Washington, et cetera. So this is not something new. This is something that has been happening since treaties were made. There has not been a treaty that was not infringed upon. So this is something that tribes bring to the Supreme Court. And sometimes a lot of the cases don't even get heard by the Supreme Court. So this is not something new, unfortunately, but is also something that will go through another process in order to litigate against something like this. If anyone else has anything to add to that.
Okay, another question. I would be curious to hear panelists' thoughts on SB 140, and if anyone needs a sort of a thing on SB 140, maybe we could post that in the chat. How do you think it would affect tribal communities and BIPOC Montanans?
Would you go ahead and put that in the chat as what SB 140 is, because I have to have my cross-reference sheets in front of me, and I don't right now. I don't know which one that is. Does anybody know what it is off the top of your head?
Yeah, so it says right here, a bill for an act entitled an act generally revising laws related to certain providing a direct appointment process for the governor to appoint district court judges and Supreme Court judges to fill judicial vacancies. Sorry.
Oh yeah, MTREP does not support that at all. That is extremely harmful.
Yeah, so it just sounds like it's related to judge appointments, and it's not voted on, correct? It's more that they're just appointed by certain political entities in the state.
Exactly. It really super politicizes the judiciary, and the judiciary is not supposed to be politicized at all. They're supposed to be, neutral and just judge on the law. But if it's up to just, a particular governor, whether they're conservative or liberal or moderate or whatever, that is ripe. That is ripe for all sorts of manipulation of the law. And that, in fact, is manipulation of the law. I mean, it's a very negative benefit for the citizenry of Montana.
Well, I just wanted to leave a little time for Iku to provide some closing statements. But again, I just want to thank you all for your perspectives and your expertise during this panel discussion. And I'm really excited to kind of hear a lot of the work everyone's involved with. So I just want to thank you all for being present.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This was a great panel. I'm so thankful for everything that folks provided for us today. I'm really excited to see what the future of Montana looks like. And yeah, I'm really excited about this, and just thank you all so much for being here and for continually working towards solidarity between our peoples, which we all know is extremely important, and for calling out the things that need to be called out. And yeah, I am about to do my little closing remark, but something that I forgot to mention at the beginning, which was something that me and my coworker Danny have been looking into more, was kind of the history of legislation and civil rights legislation in Montana. And it's actually Black women specifically in Montana who got civil rights legislation passed, because again, there were flourishing Black communities in every city in Montana previously. So that's also something that's really important for us to remember as Indigenous people, that even in the state of Montana, our liberation is completely dependent on the work of Black people, and vice versa. But anyways, okay, now to the closing remark. As we wrap up, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. Y'all are so amazing. I love you. And thank you for attending this session of the Women's Policy Leadership Institute. Sorry if we were not able to answer all your questions. I'm just going to say you can Facebook message Montana Women Vote if you have any questions, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Please remain respectful when you message. And also, we ask that you all please complete the evaluation form that is linked in the chat box, and be sure to share your name and email with us on the eval to be included in our raffle.